can hear that.
All right. Well, you did say a little bit about your work to end the death penalty in Ohio. So I thought, I'll ask you a little bit more about what's going on in that area. And what do you think of Governor DeWine's recent stays of execution?
Yeah. So, as I mentioned before, thank you for that question as well. I've introduced an end to the death penalty every time, every General Assembly since I've been a legislator. So that's starting in 2011. And it's interesting because I came to my belief about the death penalty knowing a woman who was from my one of the Unitarian churches that I went to a long time ago, and her name was Aldona, and her son had been murdered. And we had a conversation one day, and she said she actually went to the court when the sentencing was taking place, and she asked the judge to, instead of issuing the death penalty, to go to life without parole for her son's murderer. And she said it was because she didn't believe that just because this man took her son's life away, obviously wasn't going to bring her son back. And that she believed in the dignity and worth of every human being. And she wanted this person to have the opportunity to, to be able to see what he did was wrong, to somehow be able to deal with that, but she did not believe that it was her place or the place of the state of Ohio to end this man's life. And that always stayed with me. So fast forward to Governor DeWine's stay. And, this happened under the past governor, who shall not be named, as well, who, and every time we've had a stay, I have applauded the fact that in their wisdom, and frankly, because of practicality, they can't find something to execute someone. I have applauded that, but also said maybe perhaps it's now time to end the use of the death penalty. And when we're absolutely sure that someone has committed this crime, if it's a capital crime, to have the sentence be life without parole rather than the death penalty. Justice Pfeiffer, who originally overturned and returned us to the use of the death penalty, has now come out within the past 10 years and said, frankly, we should not be using the death penalty. He has called it a death lottery and has spoken to the fact, and I agree with him, it's used disproportionately across racial lines. It's disproportionately used across the state. Some counties, like mine in Cuyahoga County, have more people on death row than other counties of similar size. It's not about size, it's about use. And we know it's expensive. We know also it does not bring back a loved one. And frankly, what the conversation I intend to have with this governor, I've had with every governor, and actually going back to Governor Strickland as well, it was one of the issues we disagreed on. And every time I saw him anywhere, I would say, hello, Governor. How about let's talk about not using the death penalty anymore? But I think that it's an opportunity right now. The companies that made these drugs, they made them to save lives. These drugs are used in anesthesia. They're used to perform an operation and bring someone through on the other side in better shape than they started. And so the companies that have created these drugs do not want them used to execute people, which is why many countries have outlawed the use of the death penalty, but also many states have done it. And it's been that combination of everything from you can't use these drugs anymore, it's costly to keep someone on death row out of the general population, it's costly to go through all the appeal processes, And frankly, we as a society should be better than our most heinous criminal who committed an act. We should be better than that.
Amen, and lots more applause. I have kind of a long question here in light of your work on the death penalty. I was going to ask you to comment on a recent Texas ruling that chaplains of any faith tradition will no longer be allowed in the chamber where Texas death row inmates are executed. This decision was in response to a Supreme Court ruling in March that postponed the execution of a Texas inmate because his Buddhist advisor was not allowed in the execution chamber. So Texas only allowed prison employees in the chamber, and Texas only employs Christian and Muslim chaplains, not Buddhist.
Yeah.
So in the concurring opinion, Justice Brett Kavanaugh wrote that Texas should either allow all spiritual advisors into the execution chamber or none at all.
Wow.
Texas then said, okay, none at all. What is the Ohio practice, and do you have a response to that?
Wow. I was not aware of this, so this is new information for me. Well, there it is. All or nothing. You usually get nothing. When we talk about this all the time when we try to figure out how to come to some middle ground for some issues. So that's problematic to begin with. I think, again, so Texas has just taken a barbaric practice and which is almost unconscionable, made it more barbaric and less humane and less contact with the dignity of a human being. And to me, that's ultimately what that kind of a decision is about. If ever there was one more reason to end the use of the death penalty in executions, it's this. I mean, isn't it hard to believe that we're even having this discussion in 2019? That inside of the execution chambers, who's allowed and who isn't, that in itself is terrible. But I do think for access to all faith practices and all faith practitioners, that our prisons should always, always be open and available to every single faith leader that a specific prisoner wants to have come into the chambers, whether it's of the horrible condition that there's an execution, but certainly just as a way of practice day to day. And I appreciate you bringing this to my attention, because we will go back and check. My belief right now is that all faith practices are welcome and allowed in our prisons, but I will double check that now that you've brought this to my attention. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let's turn to Senate Bill 33 if we can. We mentioned that a little bit before. Senate Bill 33 is one that criminalizes protest at critical infrastructure sites, especially oil pipelines, fracking wells, drilling sites, and other similar places. It was apparently written by the oil and gas industry and ALEC, as you said, the American Legislative Exchange Council. It makes tampering or intention to tamper with these oil and gas sites a felony for both individuals and complicit groups like the Sierra Club or UU Justice Ohio or a congregation. In your opinion, what is driving this legislation? What's behind this push?
Well, I think what's driving this legislation is greed, and a real attempt to have the rights of private industry and their profits be superior to the individual rights of the people. And I think it's dangerous. We had this bill go through. I think it went through the House last time. Certainly I voted no. And then it went to the Senate and it died. Unfortunately, now it's starting in the Senate. And, but my hope still is that I'm hoping that there are enough people who value the right to free speech, the right to assembly, the right to peaceful protest ahead of the right to profits of a private corporation. Isn't it interesting that it's also in the fossil fuel industry? So especially the group that not only is profiting in general, but specifically is profiting from a dying industry that also kills the earth at the same time. How interesting that it's this group that they want to protect. But make no mistake, and I think you and I, Sister Joan, talked about this earlier, and it's definitely intended to be put into place now to protect fossil fuel, but there's nothing to say that in the future it can't be there to protect those who would want to pollute our lakes and waters, clean drinking water for people, the folks who protested in Flint. You know, if Lake Erie continues to have the algae blooms that it does, we're going to see protests. And we've been fighting at the removal of water from Lake Erie. I mean, it just goes on and on and on, because ultimately, I believe these laws are intended to protect and also shield from the public eye. Because when there's a protest like this, what happens? If I, as a common everyday person, didn't know anything was happening or anything was amiss, but suddenly I start seeing the reports about the protest, now the public is engaged in a broader way than they ever could be. And that, of course, is the bottom line for squelching our voices, for silencing us, and for keeping out of the public eye the information about what's happening and how damaging these kinds of public production facilities, how damaging they are to our environment and to our the common health of the people.
And more applause. I'm glad you mentioned Flint and Lake Erie, because water facilities and water treatment facilities are also listed as critical infrastructure, as is all railroad property.
Wow. Wow. Yeah.
Which is interesting. Yeah. The idea of blocking a train full of nuclear waste or things like that.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to say. You know, part of the problem with this, again, is we have a right to say, no, look, I live in Lakewood, Ohio. We have more than 27 railroad crossings in a city that is 5.6 square miles in its entirety. And so I live 5 houses from railroad tracks. So do all of my neighbors and much of the community. We are so close. And so depending on what kind of damaging waste material is being driven through our community, we not only have a right to know, but if we find out and if we have a problem with it, we have a right to protest and a right to say, I see you, this is wrong, this is not healthy, you need to stop. We have a right to say that. Mm-hmm. Last time I checked, First Amendment rights were still in place.
Yep. And definitely applause on that one as well. Yeah, we're watching that one in UU Justice, Ohio, of course. Well, let's turn to the Ohio budget. On April 2nd, the Senate passed the state's transportation budget, House Bill 62, and it included $70 million per year for public transportation, a 10.5-cent increase in the gas tax, and a 19-cent increase in the diesel fuel tax. as well as an increase in the state's earned income tax credit for low and moderate income families in Ohio. And it eliminates Ohio's front license plate requirement. And I know the discussion about the gas tax in particular has been particularly energetic. Can you tell us a little bit more about that one?
Sure. Energetic is a good word. So I was a part of, so I was the ranking member, the highest ranking member on the transportation committee in the Senate. And then when the budget passed out of the Senate and when then it went to conference committee. And the conference committee, when both sides, both chambers vote, and if they do not concur on either one's version of the budget, then it goes into conference committee. And at that point, we literally go through every single item where there's a difference. And we started with the House version of the budget. And then literally line by line, we go through and figure out whether we agree or disagree or amend at that point and try to work to final agreement because we have to, because we need to pass a budget. So those items that you brought up, I mean, I'll start with the transportation. Now, some folks were very upset about the fact that transportation funds were moved from the transportation budget itself, where they were able to use some flex funds, which are funds that still require a match, but they boost the funds that are available, but they come out of that overall budget of transportation. They decided, the Senate and the House together decided the Senate moved those funds into a specific line item in the general fund budget. This is a first in a very long time to actually have a line dedicated to public transportation in the general fund budget. That is incredible because that line item will stay there and now we can just continue to boost it. The other thing that's amazing about this is that the governor recommended a $40 million line, which was only up from the $33 million that was already dedicated to public transportation. The House raised it to 100, but the compromise, and remember, part of the work that we need to do is work to compromise, but the compromise was 70 million. That was amazing. Public transportation was a part of this discussion, that frankly, the Democrats and those who really believe and understand how important public transportation is to all of our people, but especially low-income folks who that is the way they maintain their livelihood by using public transportation. We made that an equal part of the conversation along with how we fix our roads and bridges. That is incredible. We did that with the help of our allies and supporters, people who came down to the State House, people who advocated and wrote letters. This is a win for involvement in the political process, involvement in your state government, when people are allies and advocates and get involved and called into the offices. Every senator and every House and every representative heard from the people in their communities about how important public transportation was. I got to tell you, when we started the budget in the Senate president said, yeah, we're not going to deal with that. It's not really our issue. It became our issue because of the people, because the people said this is important. So I really want to underscore how important the power of people communicating with their representatives is. And then when it came to fixing our roads and bridges and raising the gas tax, no one likes a tax increase. But I have to say that our roads and bridges, it's a safety issue. It's an issue of, it may cost a little more at the pump. Better that than you break your front axle and have to replace and have major car repairs, which we heard from a lot of people that have experienced that. You don't get a refund from the state of Ohio just because they didn't fix your road. And we've also seen that car accidents increase when our roads and bridges are not safe. And so we want to make sure, I mean, the safety issue was a big part of it for me, and for many of my colleagues. And I can't talk enough about the fact that it was really important. And the last issue that you brought up, the EITC, raising that earned income tax credit cap, was my amendment. Now, I want you to know that it also had it refundable, so they took half of my amendment, not all of my amendment. But that was also the first time that out of the Republican, across the aisle, Republican caucus agreed with us in the Democratic side and said, it's important that we provide some kind of relief for our low-income folks if we're going to raise a tax. I can't tell you, this was an amazing conversation and an amazing win. We will continue to fight for that EITC refundability in the general fund budget. We're going to continue to try to work on that. But this was an amazing process. It's what happens with compromise. But it was definitely, in the long run, I think we had much more wins than we had losses in this budget.
Budgets are definitely moral documents.
Absolutely.
What might you say is the kind of core value that you see in this budget?
Well, I think I really do believe that the moral value in it is that we have a responsibility, first of all, to fix our infrastructure, maintain our infrastructure. I have to say, part of the reason why we had to do a pretty substantial increase is because it's been since 2004, since the last time it was raised, and it wasn't raised because no one wanted to go. It was political rather than pragmatic or practical. It was based on the fact that no one wanted to be on record for raising the taxes. And, you know, taxes are not evil. They are, frankly, the way government pays to be able to provide the services that they're required and is a responsibility to provide. And so I think the moral part of this budget was forcing representatives and senators to be accountable to the people that they represent and to have some moral courage when it comes to doing the right thing rather than the best political action.
Oh, thank you. I have one more question I'm going to ask. So meanwhile, in Akron and Cincinnati and Cleveland and Toledo and here, I'm going to ask if people have questions that they type them into the chat box, or my folk here in Columbus, if they write them out on a sheet of paper and bring them to me. And I have one last question to ask you while they are doing that, okay? Yeah. People try many different ways to be heard by their representatives and their senators, both state and national. They sign petitions, they send letters, they tweet, they hold town halls, they protest on the steps of the State House, they march, I mean, all kinds of things. They camp in your office. They even vote.
Right.
Okay.
Good.
So what do you think is the best way for people like us to be really, really heard by our legislators, especially in between election times?
Yeah. Well, the space in between election times seems to be becoming smaller and smaller. I'll say that. Seems like there's always an election. It's a really great question. First of all, vote. I can't emphasize how important voting is. Being registered, making sure you're registered, and even those of you who have voted for years and years and years, as you've seen in the past, we had a purge in 2016. I think that led to some of the real changes in the results of our election. We're still trying to figure out what that purge meant. So even if you've been a voter for a long time, please, please, please always, every so often, check your registration status. It's really important. Encourage your family and friends to do, and neighbors to do the same. As far as communicating with those of us who are in elected office right now, telling your personal story, however you communicate that, whether it's a personal email to our office or a letter. Handwritten letters always get read. I make it a point in my office to make sure, if it's not a blast email, the same email with the same language from 1,000 people, but if it's a specifically independent, individual email, we read all the emails, we try to respond to them in a timely fashion, depends on what else is going on. Those are brought to my attention. And coming and testifying, if people can come and testify or come and witness, if there are times when they're gathering everyone at the State House, believe me, when we had the fight for Senate Bill 5, which was in 2011, when they were trying to take the rights away from labor unions, and thousands and thousands and thousands of people were on the front lawn of the State House and in the rotunda, it really made a difference in the power of the voices. And while the legislation still passed, people followed up. We had a referendum. We were successful. And frankly, there was a change in office after that as well. So people came and gathered together in protest. They voted for a referendum. They educated themselves. And then they voted some new folks in and some folks that they didn't agree with out of office. And then keeping in touch. But whenever anyone comes to testify, to communicate with us, whatever it is, the most effective form I have found, and I think my colleagues agree on, is the personal story. We will even tell your personal story to others. Many of them touch us in a way that few other things do.
Okay. I know that I was there for 6 hours during testimony around Senate Bill 23, the 6-week abortion ban. Oh, yes. And I know there were so many people that they're having another round of testimony as well. Right. So yeah, people are trying to be heard. I do see some questions. So let me pull up our chat box here. Here we are. Question: how do you combat being called a socialist when advocating for universal health care?
Yeah. Well, you know, I think with any of us, when there's, first of all, some of my best friends are socialists, so I don't know. I mean, I think I try to stay to the issue at hand, no matter what kind of name calling is being used, even when I don't perceive that as a particularly bad one. But I know that our 45 right now on the federal level is trying to create a narrative and use the word socialist as really a negative, terrible epithet, and make it synonymous really with non-patriotic or, or worse. And so I try really hard not to feed into that at all, but to talk about the fact that all people, we are a democracy first, and in a democracy, if it's one person, one vote, and all folks are rendered equal under the law, which may or may not be true at this point, but in order to even work on that as an aspirational goal, then at the very least, healthcare should be a right and not a privilege.
Thank you. Applause. I should also note that, at least according to the schedules we've seen, that Senate Bill 33, the anti-protest bill, is there are limited testimony being heard on the 10th of April. But also on the 10th of April, according to what we've heard, there'll be a vote on the 6-week abortion ban, possibly. So if y'all can get out to the State House on the 10th of April, there's a lot of activity going on from what we've seen.
And Sister Joan, I think it's important to mention that on this Senate Bill 33, that it's a bill to curtail our right to free assembly and speech. And as the bill's being heard itself, there's been a squelch of free speech, in that the folks who are voting, who are testifying against the bill, have been limited
Yes.
to only 5 people, where my understanding, it's not in my committee, but my understanding is that there was a lot more proponents. I think people need to let their legislators and the folks on that committee know that they are outraged by the practice in this committee. And if it's the 10th, I mean, I would urge people to, and I don't know if you all can help with, there's a way to access the committee and who's on the committee. And then I think those people on the committee, especially the chair, because this is at the pleasure of the chair, so the chair has called for this kind of testimony to be limited, folks should contact that chair and tell them how outraged they are by the fact that he's limiting people to be able to testify against the bill. That is really unusual, I have to say. I have seen a lot of parity with our committees. This is very unusual.
In the first hearing of opponents, 5 people were allowed to testify. 40 of us sent in written testimony and would have testified. And then in this session, I understand that they'll allow a big number of 8 people to testify. And,
Wow.
and there will be more. Who's the chair of that? Do you remember? Eklund?
What committee is that in?
This is the 33 is, I'll have to look that up.
Yeah, I'm not sure, because it's one of the few committees I don't serve on.
All righty. Let's see here. Let's go for some other questions here. We have Senator Dolan. Oh, who is co-sponsoring the Healthcare for All bill?
Okay, so we have not put that out for co-sponsor yet. Teresa Fetter and I are working on it. Certainly, because we have not dropped the bill, which is the official term for when we put it out for sponsorship, or when we actually put it out for consideration. I encourage everyone to contact their legislators and let them know that you would like for them to co-sponsor. And then that way, when Senator Fetter and I put the bill out for co-sponsorship, I think we're out for co-sponsor right now, they could sign on.
Okay.
Good time.
All right. Given your belief that fossil fuel corporations should not have rights over people, do you support the proposal of move to amend to eliminate corporate personhood and money as free speech?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. Not only do I support it, I have been a joint sponsor in the House, and actually that is another bill on my list of things that we will introduce again in the Senate. I'm a strong proponent of eliminating corporate personhood. This never should have happened in the first place. It's been very damaging, both for our elections, because of the dark money that's been involved, and everything in between. It is a threat to our democracy, and I am committed to continuing to work to overturn that. Absolutely.
Thank you. Now, I understand that Senator Matt Dolan proposed legislation to reduce the overly restrictive setbacks for wind power. So the question is, do you support that? And what are the chances of its passing?
Well, I think, certainly I support any way that we can encourage wind, solar, any of our sustainable energy sources. Absolutely. I think with Senator Dolan's support, it's it stands a better chance. We still have a lot of education on the part of our colleagues around sustainable energy. And I will say that everyone then is up against very, very powerful fossil fuel lobbyists and corporations and organizations. I mean, they have a lot of money and influence. So, but I am very supportive, and I think I think we can be hopeful on that legislation. But I definitely support it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Now, do you sense serious movement against the death penalty at the State House? Is this a time of opportunity?
Yeah. So it's a good question. I have been hopeful before. We had, Sister Helen Prejean has come and testified in past years. As I mentioned, former Justice Pfeiffer has come in and testified. So we were really hopeful then. Again, it's one of those things that I think we have to just continue to educate. And the thing that I'm up against, that all of us are up against when we try to do this, is the conflation of ending the use of the death penalty with embracing murderers when all is said and done. And so we have to be able to give a narrative to our colleagues that is, you can continue to be tough on crime, and also say it's time to end the use of the death penalty. And frankly, I do believe that there's an opportunity. We are going to have some of these conversations. We're probably going to have the conversations before we introduce the bill. We may not introduce the bill till the fall, but we're going to have some conversations between now and then centered around if you believe in and identify yourself as pro-life, why then does that not include supporting an end to the use of the death penalty? And we're going to have some of those conversations, as well as the fact that they can't find a way to humanely execute someone. Seems like an oxymoron just saying it. But so I believe that this year is a good year with a lot. I'm very hopeful that we may be able to move the marker this year. Yeah.
Great. Now, there was a lot of energy among a lot of people around issue 1 at the last election. And now we see that there is Senate Bill 3 that purports to try and address some criminal justice reform. What do you see in terms of any support for the issues of, or the concerns of issue 1 around criminal justice reform?
I think I was a supportive of issue 1, actually, and I think because I saw it as, well, it wasn't perfect, not much is, but it was a step in the right direction. We have to figure out a way to minimize criminal incarceration involvement for some of these very lesser crimes. And at the same time, we have to put more resources into treatment opportunities and going all the way through with folks, all the way down, because sometimes there's a limit on how much, because it's reflective of a lack of understanding on what's really needed for folks in the treatment arena. And sometimes it's a much longer span than folks who are not involved ever understand. So again, part of passing legislation, but getting these policies and practices into place is really raising the awareness and understanding of all of the issues around around incarceration, but also around what's needed in the treatment arena. I mean, I think it has to be a balanced discussion. And frankly, I think every single lawmaker should take a tour of a state prison, and they would walk away, I think, with some, and talk to some of the folks that are there and some of the inmates, and they would walk away with a new appreciation and understanding of how much we need to make changes.
Thank you.
I really think that would help.
Thank you. We have a string of questions. We don't quite have that much time. So let me look for ones where we haven't addressed something yet.
Okay.
What is going on at the state level regarding immigration? Talk about another hot topic.
You know, there has not been a lot of discussion about immigration at the state level. I think the place where it probably ends up being the most reflective is when we talk about access to healthcare and things like that. But there has not been, at least starting out the gate, this General Assembly, there has not been, as I recall, last General Assembly, there was one or two resolutions, you know, supporting what was going on at the federal level in terms of limitations. You know, there hasn't been a lot of traction in that area. I do believe that one or two very conservative members have some kind of legislation really curbing the ability of or requiring local law enforcement to really step up with questioning the status, legal status of community members when they're stopped on routine things. You know, there's a lot of communities that refuse to do that, fortunately. And I think that's how it ends up playing out on the local level and then on the state level. So at this point, we have not seen a lot of that rhetoric and conversation. That doesn't mean it can't happen. It just means for right now, it hasn't happened, but it's something that we're always trying to be vigilant about.
Okay, thank you. How would you advise folk to engage with people who are adamant about their particular position that differs from your own? Because you seem to be adept at this. What is your advice when we're speaking with folk that are just way over there and we're way over here?
Sure. My advice, my practice is to sit down and have a cup of coffee and to talk about, get to know each other.
Okay.
How many children do you have? Are you married? What's, what do you do on the days when you're not here? What do you like to do for fun? And I will tell you that I have had some of those conversations with some of the most conservative members. In fact, one time I had that kind of it started with a conversation clarifying for him. I showed him pictures of my family. He was someone who was going out into the media and saying that he was troubled by same-sex marriage, as he called it, because today it was marrying somebody of the same gender. Tomorrow it was going to be siblings. And I found an opportunity to pull him aside when no one else was around, because I didn't want to embarrass him. But I said, "Oh, Representative, I want to show you a picture of my family. Here's our daughter, here's her boyfriend, here's my partner. She and I have been together for 25 years. Here's our other daughter." And he took a breath, stepped back, shrieked, said this, and he said, "Why didn't anyone tell me?"
Mm.
And I said, well, probably because it doesn't matter in the work that I do every day. I'm effective, I'm hardworking, I'm your equal. You and I are equal. We represent the same amount of people in our districts. And probably because it hasn't really been a concern who my family is in this job, just like it doesn't matter who your family is. But I want you to know. And he said, well, thanks for being nice to me and not yelling at me. You know, I'm getting hate mail. And I said, well, I'm sure you are, because you're saying hateful things. And I said, you know, if you would just stick to the things you know to talk about and not talk about, I said, I am a lesbian. It has nothing to do with wanting to marry my sibling. And frankly, that's really insulting. But why don't you stick to the things you know how to talk about? You know a lot of information about a lot of things. And we were walking at this point and talking. And he said, well, I appreciate that you're being nice to me. And I said, well, of course. Tell me about your family. I've told you about mine. The rest of our conversation was about his family and his 2 kids and his wife and how proud he was of his kids. So what I'll just say is sometimes it goes like that, but often it starts with a cup of coffee and just finding the humanity in the other person. If we connect on our humanity, our common humanity, then all the rest of it can fall into place.
That's wonderful. And I think on that note, we're going to end this time together because we have had you talking now for an hour and a half. Bless your soul. There are more questions that people ask. Some of them are, you know, details about accountability on the
Sure.
transportation bill,
Sure.
things like that. And if I can, email those to your office.
Sure.
And it may be
Sure.
possible for you or your staff to simply send a response to a couple of those.
Sure.
It's simple, and we'll send those out to people. All right?
Okay, that would be great. Well, thank
you
you
all.
so much. I very much appreciate this. Thank you. It's been lovely. I appreciate all the work that you do, and I feel very fortunate that you all have always been with me as we've worked on some of these issues of social justice. And fortunately or unfortunately, there's a lot of work ahead of us. So I appreciate the partnership, and I'm glad to be with you all in the fight. Thank you.
Thank you. We much appreciate you, and I'll be seeing you at the State House.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.